We are super excited to do this webinar today, or actually have Lucian do this webinar today. When Ben came back from the Digital Humanities conference this summer, he had a conversation with someone kind of trying to figure out if there is a way to do exactly what Lucian's doing, but he hadn't seen Lucian's presentation yet, and that was like the next day. So he was super excited about what Lucian's been able to do, and introduce Lucian in the presentation.
Yeah. So again, at the Digital Humanities conference this summer, I was most impressed. I was blown away by what Lucian is doing here. And I think it has some really interesting applications for findability and the way that people interact with digital text, whether they're archival or published. And it really blew my mind. So I'm so happy that Lucian was willing to join us here. Lucian is a doctoral candidate at the School of Information Science at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His research falls between digital humanities and computational social science. He leverages the unique affordances of large language models and natural language processing to analyze large-scale collections of historic and cultural documents. And he is particularly interested in discovering instances and patterns of intellectual influence from unstructured text corpora. So that's Lucian's bio, and so Lucian, you want to take it away?
Great. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's a pretty good introduction. So my name is Lucian, and I'm a PhD candidate at Illinois. So today I'm going to be talking about this recent work on a method to detect and quantify intellectual influence in text corpora, especially in these sorts of either historical or contemporary contexts where we don't have this kind of culture and standardized practice of citation that we see in sort of like scholarly academic publication, right? So, So for contemporary academic publications, as I'm sure a lot of you know as archivists, there's a wealth of structured data sets on citations, influence, and all of that kind of metadata, which allows scholars to very easily trace influence and citation relationships between communities and scholars without really special like technical or domain expertise on the matter. But of course, in the 19th century, citation standards were far, far, far more flexible, regardless of what academic discipline you're talking about, right? So ranging from religious studies, natural science alike, practiced very free-form, non-standardized citation practices. As on the left, you see these claims that are attributed only to authors instead of specific works. And as on the right, you can see that these publications are sometimes blending together multiple citations in the same statement in a way that only experts can disentangle. And for some of these cases, if an author is cited in this way, you really have to read through their entire corpus of work to trace the specific provenance of a quote, which creates huge barriers for scholars who are studying phenomenon that or subject areas that extend beyond their expertise. Also, we might not only be interested in this sort of impact exerted between scholarly publications and disciplines, but also between scientific discipline publications and other forms of media, such as literature, popular press, and public policy documents. Doing this can provide us a fuller picture of sort of this web of interconnections between different areas and forms of culture, but is completely missing even from these nicely structured contemporary citation data sets. So in this quote, we can see that Darwin has this metaphor of the web of life, right? That George Eliot echoes in Middlemarch. Right? Eliot uses the exact same metaphor of this kind of very complicated web to describe a complex network of human relationships. She draws the same conclusion as Darwin, right? That in this highly complex situation, that we have to focus on the particular specific parts of this network rather than trying to understand the general structure, right? So there's clearly some kind of thematic or metaphorical echo here that isn't, the result of direct quotation, right? She's not like saying, oh, this part is from origin of species. And of course, we know that this isn't random chance because literary scholars have examined the correspondence between Eliot and Darwin, and they know that Eliot really was very interested in sort of like Darwin's publications and books. But of course, that again relies on this enormous complex infrastructure of experts in the papers, publications, and letters of both authors. So because these two are like huge canonical figures, they get this kind of attention, but countless lesser known examples exist that subject area experts haven't focused on studying and are currently completely unknown. So this is a very big problem, and a lot of different people have tried to take computational approaches to kind of make inroads on this. Right? Generally, these prior approaches fall under three broad categories, and don't worry if this is a bit too technical. I'll be going through some of the implementations later on in the talk. So yeah, they fall under these three broad categories of approaches. This sort of text reuse is probably the simplest conceptually to understand, right? They're just looking for direct copying quotation. And doing this approach produces really high confidence results, but is very brittle when dealing with the low quality OCR that we see in real digitized books, because even slight corruptions will kind of ruin the ability of exact word matches. And they also fail to completely to capture indirect influence, sort of uncredited paraphrasing, or kind of just more indirect influence. Scholars who are dealing with the sort of history of ideas or conceptual history have used a lot of these neural network-based methods, particularly focused on word-level embeddings. And I'll go much more in depth on like what this actually looks like in the next section. But what these methods capture is shifts in word sense, so how words are actually used, and kind of these stylistic features. So they provide a very high-level view of how these concepts are combined and elucidated, but consequently they lose kind of focus on the semantic details of like what the actual claim that's being advanced is. And other studies have experimented with topic models, which capture really high-level patterns in sort of subject matter and what documents are about, but again lose sight of on a sentence per claim level, like what exactly is being advanced. And an additional consideration that we kind of have to make is this sort of computational complexity of these methods, right? So the topic model, generating topic models for documents and then comparing them is relatively very cheap compared to these other methods, but using neural networks, fine-tuning word embedding, or even larger language models on specific time slices, which is what these other studies do, scale really poorly to really large data sets, or complex comparisons between different authors or documents. And paradoxically, like people have been doing this sort of text reuse detection for a long time, but it's actually extremely inherently a very computationally intensive problem, because you have to compare basically every single pair of like different document strings to sort of comprehensively do that kind of search, right? There's no way to really make that more efficient than it already is. So before we move on, I just want to give this kind of quick crash course on how researchers have tried to represent text and different approaches that they've taken to this problem. So the basic unit that we work with when dealing with machine learning, when trying to have computers understand different types of data, is called a vector or an embedding. And I'll be kind of using both words interchangeably, but they essentially mean the same thing, right? So if you think back to like high school geometry, we can think of this as a location in space that's defined by any number of dimensions, right? So in a simple real world example is longitude and latitude, right? So given a combination of these two numbers, we can describe any location in the world. And we can also calculate distances between any pair of locations using only sort of operations between those sets of two numbers. As humans, right, so we can only think on 3 dimensions maximum, right? We have a lot of difficulty visualizing beyond this length, height, and width paradigm. But for computers, there's no limit to these kinds of dimensions, right? But when we do visualizations and these sorts of things, we kind of have to project things down to 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions so that we can actually wrap our heads around it. But computers do, they can handle hundreds or thousands of dimensions without any sort of theoretical problem. So on a really high level, what we're trying to do here is to design a scoring system that places similar text together in this sort of space projection, this is coordinate system, while pushing dissimilar text further apart. So how do we actually extend this sort of vector concept to text, right? So given these two sentences, this the child makes a dog happy and the dog makes the child happy, how do we represent it in a numerical vector that a computer can actually understand? And so the simplest approach is to just count every word in our corpus, right? So each document is just represented by the number of times each word appears, as we can see here, right? We're counting child, dog, happy makes the appears twice, every other word appears once. So we end up with this kind of numerical vector representing each sentence. Right, so this is really easy to implement, and in fact is essentially what people have been doing since like the 1990s, but it runs into a few potential issues, right? So first, we completely lose the order of words. We can see that the two sentences have completely different meanings, right? The dog and child are swapped, but in the numerical representation, it's the exact same. And also, if we make slight paraphrasing changes, for example, changing dog to canine or happy to elated, will result in a completely different representation, because the method doesn't have any sense of what the words actually mean that it's working with. Likewise, if we have a small OCR error that changes dog from DOG to DEG, for example, that'll also completely change the representation of the embedding, right? Because they're now just different words. So people have also used what are called n-grams, which a lot of people have probably heard of, which are just doing this exact same kind of word count approach, but instead of counting individual words, counting groups of contiguous words into n lengths, so 2, 3, 4 length runs that we observe in our data. So this is also quite brittle because only the exactly matching sequences, which are pretty rare in real life, will actually result in matches, right? So even if if it's like this is big, and if it changes to this is a big, it'll be a completely different representation that won't be captured in the same sort of way. So in terms of previous research, right, the text reuse methods, such as Mullen and Funk's study, use this sort of n-gram overlap to study exact copying in these early American law codes in their study. Right, so for each section, they're just counting the number of overlapping runs of words between whatever current law code they're looking at and previous law codes to create these influence visualizations. Right, so in this context where you actually expect a lot of exact copying, exact duplication, you can kind of apply this kind of method, and it's very simple to implement, and it's very you have extremely high confidence that this is actually the exact same text. You can just look at it and realize that it is just the exact same. But to kind of address some of the issues with simple word counts, researchers in around 2014, 2015 developed this idea of word embedding, which are essentially neural network models that learn from relatively large collections of real-world text, real-world language, and learn co-occurrence between different neighboring words, right? So words that tend to appear in similar contexts. So they kind of leverage this large corpus machine learning approach to generate a scoring system which scores attributes for each word in hundreds of dimensions in a way that places similar words that appear in similar senses closer together, and dissimilar words further apart. And this is kind of how they train it, right? So they just take a bunch of real sentences. This is like a very simple example, but it's essentially this, right? And for each word, they look at each other word that appears within, a close distance to that word. And they kind of just assign those attributes to that word. And the actual math, the underlying math is quite complicated, so I'll basically skip over it. But what this essentially produces are these kinds of numerical representation of words, where words that are used in similar ways appear closely together. So you can see this area of grotesque, hideous, horrid, beastly. They're all adjectives that describe this awful experience. And then charming, cute, gorgeous, magnificent. This method produces vectors that place similar words closely together in whatever embedding space you're looking at. Right, so in terms of previous work on the problem I'm talking about, this paper by Sony and Klein uses word embeddings to detect this kind of novelty and influence, right? So they train different word embedding models, right? Previously, we see that previous models, they were trained on kind of like, all of the text on the internet. Probably not at that scale, but, a huge percentage of the text on the internet. But what Sony and Klein did was they took text from different historical time periods, and then they trained different embedding models on each time slice, right? So for example, looking at a word like cabinet, they found that, the word cabinet initially was more associated linguistically with concepts like a cabinet of curiosities, right? So concepts like geography, other sciences in this early time period. But gradually there's a shift to this political meaning of cabinet, like the president's cabinet, right? So then they took these models and then they could identify specific authors and texts that were sort of ahead of the curve in shifting the conceptual understandings of words, right? So this is, as I mentioned before, right? This captures this kind of like high-level drift in ideas and concepts, but actually you can't learn anything about what they're actually saying about, the president's cabinet in this, right? There's no connection between this and the actual argument that's being advanced. And then another interesting feature for these word embeddings that will be important for us is that you can perform all kinds of different like arithmetic on them, right? So by adding and subtracting vectors, as we can see here, you can actually combine their meanings. So for this case, we can see that when you subtract sort of the representation for man away from king, and then you add woman, so you replace this kind of male vector with a female vector, then you arrive at queen, right? Which we would expect. But there's no limit on kind of how much you can combine this, right? So if you sum together all the words in a sentence, in theory, in practice, it's a bit more difficult than that, but in theory, you end up with a single vector representation that contains all the content of that specific sentence. Okay, so the problem with word embeddings is that they try to apply this kind of universal system. They learn a single representation of each word from a larger context without kind of considering how the word is actually used in the specific sentence you're looking at, right? So they learn these universal representations from large collections of text, but they can't understand the contextual nuances of the sentence. Right? For example, all of these pre-existing word embedding models represent the word mouse as one thing, right? Even though depending on the context, they can have radically different meanings of either the animal mouse or the computer mouse. So they can't rely on the sort of universal representation to fully understand what the word means. They have to consider the context of surrounding words to actually understand what the word means in the situation, right? So to understand if we're talking about this animal mouse or the computer mouse, we need to see if there's references to like cheese or clicking or whatever to sort of disambiguate the two. Yeah, and this is what led to the development of BERT and other transformer-based language models, which are the foundation for modern LLMs like ChatGPT as well, right? They're the same technology, just essentially with larger and larger training data sets. And again, this is a lot more complicated than how I'm presenting it now, but just to go quickly, right? So what a transformer basically does is it allows each word to learn relationships with every other word in whatever sentence you're putting in, right? So if we look on these right two examples, we can see that this token for language, it's able to learn from every other word in the sentence, right? But it's because of the way the architecture of the model is designed, it's able to identify that this complicated and this complicated adjective is actually referring to language, right? So it's taking additional influence from the surrounding words that are relevant to it. And we can see that executive is learning from former, the, and it's essentially identifying the words that are important to help understand the meaning of whatever word you're looking at. Another quality of BERT that previous methods do not have is that because they're able to look at all of their neighboring words, right, they can do more creative ways to split up, to tokenize the sentences that you're putting in. So previous methods, they had to maintain these individual words with coherent meanings. Otherwise, in context, like if you just broke it up into prefixes and suffixes, they would have no meaning themselves, right? They only have meaning in the context of the surrounding other prefixes and suffixes that combine together to make a word. So BERT can actually break words up into prefixes and suffixes that are linked together through this transformer attention mechanism so that the model can adapt to unfamiliar words, right? So we can see in this case, this supercalifragilisticexpialidocious might not ever appear in the corpus, right? But by breaking it into each of these individual components, it can try to make a guess at using these different Latin roots and prefixes and suffixes to try to make a guess at like, what kind of contextual information this word might contain, even if it's never seen it before. And I'll talk about this, but this is especially useful for sort of unconventional spelling or orthography we see in historical text and OCR error, right? That the OCR error that messes up a word will completely break a previous method. It'll make that word completely unrecognizable, but models like BERT and newer models can actually try to guess at what went wrong and what the original word was meant to be. So BERT is taking in this kind of input, and it's able to convert each word into a contextualized embedding, which captures sort of very high-level language-wide meanings of words, but also incorporates the specific contextual details and relationships to neighbors, right? So these embedding representations for each word that BERT is able to output represents this kind of hybrid of higher level meaning and contextual meaning in relation to other words in the sentence. So what this third study that was kind of trying to solve this influence problem, they take this kind of BERT model and then they apply this to influence detection. So this is kind of a complicated figure, but if we think back to what Sony et al. Were doing with the conceptual drift of how the word cabinet was being used, they're essentially doing the exact same thing, right? So they're training new models, new BERT-based models on each time slice to study how specific individual words are being used and changes in word sense, right? So they're looking at, in this one, they're essentially trying to have the model guess in this like specific RICO statutory context. I think they looked at like kind of like congressional bills or speeches or something. But what they're saying is they're able to guess at how surprising or unpredicted a word's appearing in a specific context is. Right. So again, right, this is the same kind of thing where it's actually very heavily stylistically based, right? That they're looking at this kind of idea of how words are being used and how arguments are being constructed and framed, but not necessarily what the specific arguments are, because they're only looking at it at the level of individual words. Okay, so back to kind of, that's the end of our little summary technical background. So what these previous methods are struggling with, right? So in real digitized corpora, what they struggle with is both a combination of kind of OCR error and differences in sort of like how changes in ways that arguments are expressed that aren't based on specific text reuse or the use of exact quotation. Right, so in the first example, we can see that there's a bit of restructuring, like some of the clauses are being moved around. There's minor word changes, and then there's a lot of OCR error, right? But broadly, it's a near exact quotation with OCR noise. But these previous approaches that are word-based are really vulnerable to this OCR error as they rely on fixed vocabularies of real words, right? So if they see these things that are like misspellings or weird symbols, they run into a lot of problems. And in the second example, the problem is a lot more difficult, right? So if you actually read and think about what the sentencers are saying, they're actually making the exact same claim. Like there's actually no like, semantic drift at all. but the sentence is completely paraphrased, right? So only the words natural selection are actually shared between the two sentences, but they're actually making the same argument. But if we look at these text reuse, topic model, vocabulary-based methods, we'll really struggle here, right? You kind of need this neural network approach to actually, that actually understands what specific words are trying to say to really even make any headway into detecting the similarity here. Okay. So for my project, my main goal was to discover instances of substantively similar pairs of claims across a large sentence, across a large corpus at the sentence level. So given a set of arguments, right, from a book or any other academic publication, can we efficiently search a massive corpus for all instances of both exact quotations, paraphrasing, potentially similar arguments, and even that sort of like metaphorical higher level resonance to provide a contextualized and complete view of influence? And also, when dealing with real digitized books and OCR data, how robust is this method to the real world context? So hopefully what my method does is synthesizing what previous approaches were doing, right? So I want to both look at very granular individual claim level, like what arguments are actually being advanced that the text reuse tries to capture, but also identify some of this like sort of stylistic features and indirect influence that those word embedding approaches were trying to detect. So let's talk about the corpus that I look at. So to build this corpus, I gathered a set of proceedings and journal publications from these British and American learned societies, for example, like the Royal Society, and then these different discipline-specific societies like Geographic, National Geographic, Royal Biological Society. So people in these proceedings who like are attending the meetings or directly cited in the articles, I identify as being affiliated with that community and in sort of these emerging disciplinary organizations, right? So I identify the people, I extract the people with NER techniques, and then I supplement this with also a list of Darwin's direct correspondence, because I think the sort of experimental setup that I was doing was kind of looking at Darwin specifically because there's a lot of literature on different people that he's interacted with and exerted influence on, to sort of approximate Darwin's intellectual circle. So then I took all of this list of this like list of a few hundred, I don't have it here, but it's a few 100,000 authors to query the Internet Archive and then download all the digitized books that are available online from each author. And then these are the disciplinary communities I sampled from. So I tried to capture a range of subjects from natural history, chemistry to social sciences. So currently I've downloaded about 300,000 books and run the full analysis pipeline on about 250,000. It's important to note here that like the digitized online data set from Internet Archive is not especially representative. So there's a lot of unbalanced classes for both different disciplinary communities and also over time, right? So we can look at this. These digitization projects tend to have a bias for more recent books, which have survived in university collections, haven't been pruned, or just have a much more are much more likely to still exist in university collections to be digitized. And then I take a few additional normalization steps to sort of correct for these biases, like weighing later books less heavily than earlier books, and then just calculating not comparisons across communities, but only within communities. Great. So let's talk about what I'm actually doing in terms of the analysis. So if you recall from where we were from the earlier technical background, right? So we have BERT, and BERT is capable of producing these contextualized word embedding representations for each word in an input using this neural network model, right? So it's able to both understand what the word means on a bigger linguistic sense, and also specifically in the sentence, how it's related to all the other parts, right? So we have these numerical representations for each word in the corpus. So then, as I was talking about before, this is in theory, right? If we take all of the vectors that represents a sentence, and then we combine them together, theoretically, we should arrive at a single numerical representation for the entire sentence, right? So then taking that, we can calculate a lot of different types of distance and clusterings to detect similar sentences, right? That are appearing together in the same space. So this is a high-level visualization of what we're doing, right? So using BERT, which is the embedding model, we can convert each text into a numerical representation and then plot them into this space, and then find the nearest neighbors, find distances between different sentences in this space. So these sentences that make related or semantically similar arguments should be placed closer together in space, while dissimilar sentences are being pushed further apart. Right, so this is a really simple visualization in 2 dimensions, but in practice, right, the actual points are being placed on hundreds of different dimensions to sort of maximize different types of relationships and distances between the claims. Yeah, so what I end up using is, it's a model that's called GTE, but essentially the architecture is what I've basically described already. It's using BERT, and it's the model, the GTE model was optimized to place semantically similar sentences together in a vector space, right? So they take a lot of training data that are both just random text from the internet that they've scraped, like hundreds of millions of different sentences that appear together, that are related somehow from internet data, and also these carefully curated question answering, logical entailment data sets that people have put together for machine learning research to fine tune their embeddings. So if you're interested in actually reproducing this, it's a lot simpler than it sounds, right? There's a open source repository system called Hugging Face, which kind of packages all of these models in a way that's actually quite user-friendly relative to a lot of this like machine learning ecosystem. So don't be too intimidated. Like with basic coding knowledge, it's not super difficult to actually like make the system work. So this is a sample of what they're doing to train this GTE model, right? But they repeat this across hundreds of millions of sentences from a wide range of different sources. So we can see from these sentences that they're kind of like pretty simple, and they're all like paraphrase detection tasks, right? So like a person on a horse jumps over a broken down airplane, or a person is outdoors on a horse, right? So that there's a lot of overlap in what those sentences are doing, even though there's some extraneous parts. Yeah, people, children smiling and waving at camera, or there are children here, right? So, so on top of this like baseline training that they did on contemporary text, I further fine-tuned the model on a hand annotated set of potential matches from, the 19th century, the corpus that I'm looking at, to try to both remove some false matches. So popular phrases like, oh, I will not demonstrate, or the result should be quite obvious, that don't actually have any semantic content, and to kind of train the model a bit to adapt to the specific language of the time period that I'm looking at. Right? So that's essentially that's the model I'm using, right? So then I take this model and I convert each sentence of the corpus into an embedding representation. And once all sentences in every book have been embedded, I put them into this sort of searchable vector database called FAISS. And the actual like math again for how this is actually working is quite complicated. But what it essentially does is it enables really efficient distance calculations between vectors, right? So instead of having to calculate every single pair of distances between every single point, it's using some kind of indexing system to identify only the potential, like the ones that are maybe close enough to fit. And this method is highly efficient, right? So I only have to pass the text through this neural network once to generate a numerical representation. And then we put all these embeddings into the system that's really only searching a few hundred potential matches for these really fast similarity calculations, right? So the amount of calculations relative to previous methods, it's just much lower. And I was able to kind of run this entire system for 300,000 books without any GPUs, like within a few weeks, which is, yeah, like on the scale of what people were doing before, it is a lot simpler, right? So, and because I'm hoping to really scale this up to kind of like try to build something for the entire 19th century, having this kind of efficiency is really important. To run this method on the entire corpus of, potentially hundreds of millions or billions of claims. Yeah, so then we can take any text of interest and then feed all the sentences into the vectorizer and then the corpus scale search algorithm, even if it's not already existing in this corpus, right? So you can take any new text and kind of see how it's fitting into this system I've already built. Right. So first, I kind of wanted to show that the method is robust to OCR error, right? So I create a simulation of OCR error to kind of to evaluate how robust the method is. Essentially, I'm taking these real sentences from Project Gutenberg books, which are hand transcribed, so theoretically shouldn't have, as many typos, and then randomly corrupt characters. I then take the corrupted sentences and calculate how many words are corrupted, right? So if one character in a word is corrupted, then the whole word becomes ruined. And then I also calculate the sentence embedding similarity between the original and the corrupted sentence to see how robust it is, right? So because most of these previous approaches are relying on word level tokenization, we can see that that's highly brittle, right? So even this fairly normal for like real digitization of like 5 to 10% OCR can result in 25 to 50% of the word tokens being corrupted. But because of the tokenization strategy that BERT uses, right, that the subword tokenization, it's a lot more resilient to this kind of error. If a piece of a word is corrupted, it can still try to guess at the meaning. So we can see that these embedding representations remain relatively stable, at like the normal levels of error, 5 to 10% we see. It's essentially the representations are the same, even with the OCR error. But even when there's up to 25% character error, it's still relatively close to the original embedding representations. Okay, so then in terms of how, the interesting results, how we actually use this. So we can think of the product of doing this kind of search as producing a contextualized edition, right? So given a chunk of text from a publication, we can read each sentence alongside both the past appearances and kind of future impact on different works in the corpus. So we can zoom in on this individual claim, right? So for this observation of an animal called a hydra, Darwin doesn't give any source in Origin of Species, right? It's not cited at all. And also as an aside, I've learned a lot of like random fun facts about animals in the course of working on this project. So, but although Darwin doesn't give a source, the claim appears in a wide range of natural history works published before Origin of Species, right? So we can see that in these two books, it's essentially the same claim about like how you can turn this animal inside out, and it'll like still be alive, it'll still function properly. And we can also see that future arguments that are for and against Darwin's theory engage with the claim as well. And most either don't cite it either, or actually in fact cite Darwin as the author of the claim, right? Instead of, the fact that it's appeared in this sort of collection before. Each claim we can situate each claim in a timeline of appearances, regardless of incorrect citations or our scholarly biases or expectations. And it's important to remember here that, this is not a complete view of, the history of this claim or the history of this idea, right? It suffers from the same gaps and exclusions as the corpora that we have, and only represents when this idea was introduced to this specific discourse community, not when it was first invented or articulated. So then this figure shows the pre and post publication similarity scores for all the books in the corpora, right? So for all three books, the plot is centered at the year that the specific book was published. And then each dot represents the percentage of books that we detect similarity with, X years before, like 5 years before, 10 years before, 15 years before. And the lines are just showing the average percentages pre-publication and post-publication. So for the origin of species, we can see that it's in red. We can see that Darwin is drawing from some books pre-publication, but there's a notable shift in the overall scholarly discourse after publication. That there's a lot more influence after, right? Which is what we would expect for an influential book. And for Descent of Man, which was published 15 years after Origin of Species, we can see that Darwin is drawing a lot more from previous works, and also that his ideas have already kind of entered into the public discourse, right? It's not nearly as revolutionary of a book, but there is still a major shift in kind of post-publication influence, right? So it still exerts a major influence on the overall scholarly discourse. And then this third random book in green is just included to show that this is not like a corpus-wide effect, right? That not every book is having this kind of big shift in what people are talking about before and after. And these two plots show the percentage of books published after the books of interest without with any similarity, right? So we can start with the high confidence matches on the right? So, sorry, on the left. So these are cases where the embedding representations are almost identical. So cases where it's basically just exact quotations or direct, like only a few words are changed for paraphrasing. So we can see for the two Darwin books that books by people Darwin is corresponding with are much more likely to have similar ideas, which is what we would expect, right? That they're part of Darwin's intellectual circle. And as a further sanity check, we can also see that in natural philosophy, so biology and geology, the Darwin books exert much greater influence than in chemistry, for example, which is also what we would expect. And then as with the previous graph, the last two books are just random books published to show that there's not a big difference in sort of overall influence for these random books, right? And then on the right, so even when we lower this confidence threshold, so we allow for more speculative matches that might not have any quotation, but are just similar arguments or more lax requirements, we see the same expected patterns, that Darwin's correspondence are more influenced, and biology, natural philosophy is more influenced than other fields. So because we don't have any like ground truth labeled data sets for this kind of historical context, we have to do this kind of evaluation, right? So this kind of evaluation that's based on our expectations from the historical literature. So although we don't have any concrete, true or false values here, we can have some confidence in the method's ability to discover real examples of influence, even though we don't have the more high confidence evaluation data sets. So then by aggregating the past and future influences we discover for each claim, we can go into the past and see where Darwin is drawing influence from, or if he introduced the argument into each specific context. And we can go into the future to see how each claim is resonating in different fields. So we see here that Darwin was the first to introduce several ideas into this corpus, likely observations from his journeys, and he drew substantially from geology. However, his work primarily resonated with publications in biology and medicine. Right? So in a way, he was kind of an intermediary figure between the sort of geography, geology disciplines and the sort of biological discipline. Okay, so in terms of future work, I hope to take this in two directions. So for my future work analysis on this corpus, I hope to construct something similar to a citation network with similar passages between books, and then study how ideas are disseminating across this system, especially between disciplinary boundaries. So we can take individual claims and examine them in this sort of historical context, and we can incorporate the text and metadata characteristics to model and predict factors that contribute to the spread and influence of ideas. Right, so I've essentially used ideas to build a speculative citation network for the 19th century. In effect, I hope to reproduce methods from bibliometrics in a context with no formal citations. And there's a host of these analytical questions about influence and idea diffusion that can be answered with this kind of new data set. And I'm particularly interested in sort of how these scientific ideas are diffusing and especially into kind of the public sphere, such as policy, literature, and popular media in this time period. But in the other direction, right, by using this framework and data set, we can build these sort of contextual editions that I've mentioned for literary historians and historians of science to use for their research, like that previously highlighted excerpt from Darwin. But they can put in any specific works of interest that they're interested in, right? So instead of understanding each work as a product of an individual and influence from their small set of documented collaborators, as a lot of history of science writing is today, this approach can enable scholars to cast a much wider net in their search for the origins of the claims they're seeing and the future influence. So by allowing scholars to query their texts, which if they're curious about individuals or texts that are challenging conventional assumptions against well-known texts and authors, I hope that this method can help discover the impact of forgotten or erased contributions to the sort of history of science or the history of epistemology, especially knowledge systems of indigenous peoples that, if we could fit their text into this sort of search system, women scholars and explorers, and then other marginalized groups who are not established, who are not given a place in the sort of established narrative of the history of science. And then finally, I don't have too much time to talk about this, but if you're curious, I have another paper that I'm working on that you can take a look at later. But there's sort of moving beyond this sort of semantic meaning alone, right? So this example that I start with about Darwin's influence in fiction, right? This GT method that I'm currently using is able to pick up some of those resonances, right? That there is similarity that's detected between these two statements, but there's a lot of these different types of similarities in the use of metaphor or argument structure that focusing on this sort of semantic meaning alone isn't going to pick up, right? So this sort of visual metaphor of the web connecting all of humanity, and then the similar metaphor of the web of life in the origin of species, right? That these two sentences aren't making the same argument. They're using the same metaphor, but we can't really discover this with current methods because they're adapted to measuring semantic meaning. So I'm currently working on a different method where I'm generating knowledge graphs, which maybe there's a lot of background knowledge here that I'm going too quickly through. But what I'm trying to do essentially is taking these concepts and then studying how they're compared and connected, and then creating a representation of documents based on the structure of how concepts are being connected and compared. And yeah, sorry for going a bit quickly here, but the intuition is that knowledge graphs map this kind of intellectual space, and then measuring alignment and similarities and kind of structure in the structure of how the graphs work will offer insights into this sort of more abstract metaphorical or conceptual space. And then this is the quick paper for the knowledge graph approach if you're interested in learning more, and also we can talk about it for the Q&A, which we have less time for than I expected. And then this is the link to the actual paper for this presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I hope this was interesting and useful for whatever problems and questions you're working on. I'm also extremely open to collaborations. I'm especially for people who want to kind of apply this data set or this approach to their specific corpora or figures of interest. So please reach out if you think this method could be a good fit, and we can talk about it. Thank you, everyone.
Wow. Thank you so much, Lucian. That is amazing. And thank you so much for expanding. Back at the Digital Humanities Conference, Lucian only had, I think, 10 minutes.
Yeah, 10 minutes.
to give this talk. And yeah, it was it assumed you had to assume a lot of expertise on the point of your audience. So we're going to take questions, and we are if it's okay with Lucian, we are okay running as long as people have questions. I'd love to hear some good discussion here. If you have questions, would you please type them in the chat? We may go to verbal Q&A after that, but we want to give everybody a chance. And I'd actually like to start with a question. One of the things that so impresses me about this method is the ways that it might let us connect not just, you know, ideas and published authors, but also connect documents in archival collections based on their reference, right? I'm thinking about some of the really disparate collections, like Library of Virginia has a collection of the Virginia revolutions and the American Revolution. We have all these committees of correspondence who are, you know, independently, semi-independently drafting resolutions about the British government and, you know, what that means for slavery and what that means for the colonies and things like that. This is kind of this hot topic, and the idea of being able to connect them all. So I was curious whether you see applications of this methodology as a discovery system for researchers who are looking for these influences and these connections.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that a large part of what I was trying to get at here, right, is that this is something that like is purely a tool for actual domain specific historians and researchers to kind of what this is doing, right, is essentially running a search process on a much larger corpus than and in a much more indirect, abstract way than kind of our conventional search processes, right? And when people are doing like this sort of archival research, there's not really the time and energy to like take each sentence and then go to like all of these disparate archives, as you say, and then like do the search process. And even if they do that, right, it's this sort of like keyword match kind of search that's only picking up a small percentage of what's actually similar, right? So I think my hope for this is that you know, that this is the foundation for developing into some kind of tool, right? Some kind of like enhanced archival search tool. And that's what I was trying to get at with saying like these sorts of like contextual additions that we can build using this. Yeah, but the goal there is definitely all for to enhance historical research.
Fantastic. We have our first question in the chat from Kiri Wagstaff. When you were simulating OCR errors, was that based on realistic, empirically observed error types? So 1 becomes capital I, or is that based on randomly swapped characters? And Mia Ridge of the British Library responds with that follow-up as well.
Yeah, I didn't have the time to mention it, but no, it's just completely random, which I understand that it's a bit of a it'll be different, right? Like that because the real OCR errors are not randomly distributed, it'll be different results. But I had trouble trying to come up with a way to actually, especially like generating random OCR errors at these probability thresholds. Because I think the real problem is actually that at these high OCR thresholds, like the errors are distributed in a different way than low OCR thresholds.
Well, what's cool is that there's patterns, so they'd actually probably be closer once you get to the embeddings approach, right? Like, I don't think your data would get any worse if you had more accurate or more realistic, maybe.
I would love to do a test using ground truth of, say, human transcribed documents and handwritten text recognition output of the same thing and check to see what the embeddings are between the correct and incorrect version. I think that would be really cool.
I think that's definitely a great, and I think this is what Ben originally emailed me about.
That's what we think about
after the conference. But yeah, no, I think definitely like if you have access to that kind of data and like at a large enough scale to do this kind of statistical testing, it would be really cool. But I just kind of threw this together for the final paper version, and I was just like, it's okay, it's close enough. But yeah, so it's definitely the results will be different with real OCR.
So another comment from Kiri, it seems like people would be interested in applying this idea tracing approach to plagiarism detection in humanistic writing and the larger problem of attribution in LLM generated text. Ooh, yeah, that's a cool idea.
Yes.
And what are your thoughts on that?
So the plagiarism detection, there's actually papers that are essentially using this method to do that. So I think the innovation for what I'm doing here is not necessarily like this sort of sentence embedding thing is someone else published it, right? Like that sort of plagiarism detection is a really kind of a hotter area than the sort of like historical text. So there's a lot of work that are essentially using the same approach to do that. I have some of it in the paper, I think, if you want to take a look at that. The LLM attribution, it's definitely something that I'm thinking about here. So the interesting thing is that if any of you have heard of RAG, retrieval augmented generation in LLMs, the first half of RAG is essentially what I'm doing here, right? Is that they have a database of potentially relevant information documents that they want to give to the language model. And they need to retrieve it in this way. And then the good ones, the people who are doing it like conscientiously are tagging it with the specific citation for where it's coming from. So you can go back to the original text and make sure there's no like crazy hallucinations, right? So essentially people are already thinking about this, but I think in terms of like for copyright or sort of IP protection purposes for like small authors who are seeing if their texts are being reproduced in LM generations, I think this could definitely be a useful tool.
Wow.
Yeah.
I've got another question for potential applications. Do you see any way for this to work not just with OCR errors, but also to actively improve OCR processes themselves?
I've never thought of that. I think the problem here is that there's a lot of ways, as I was kind of gesturing at, like if a sentence is like completely paraphrased, but in a way that like, you know, you're changing every word into a synonym or whatever, it'll still be the same like embedding representation, right? Because it's trying to capture this kind of semantic meaning. So I think it's very hard to use it to like ensure that the OCR is correct, right? Because in a lot of cases, when you're doing these sorts of language model enhanced like OCR correction, they're like changing words to be like more modern or whatever, right? Like it's preserving the meaning, but if you're interested in actually like having an exact transcription, there's a lot of problems there, right? Because especially with these kinds of like word embedding based methods, right? Like words that have the same embeddings are interchangeable, right? Words that have similar meanings are almost interchangeable in the system. So when you're actually concerned about accurately capturing exactly what the original text is, they're not as strong for that.
So Kayla Kavanaugh writes that she is fascinated by the idea of using computational technology to connect metaphors that have disparate semantic meanings, but center around a similar feeling or affect. Have you thought about collaborating with artists or poets to develop a tool to trace emotions in language? And then Jin P adds on to that saying, similarly, could this be used for religious text or fictional text as well?
No, that's really cool. I haven't talked with any poets. Artists is kind of interesting. I'm not sure. I guess you don't mean visual artists. Is that, I think that's where yeah, I mean there's a lot of I am thinking about like doing something with visual like images, but it would be hard to like it's hard to like wrap my head around it. Poetry and fiction, I'm definitely extremely interested in talking with people who have ideas on this. I'm not sure codifying it as emotion. It's probably way beyond the capabilities now, although the LLMs are getting better every day. But I just think that those sorts of things where there's like, you know, if it's meant to elicit an emotional response or to convey some of those things, I think the models are still much worse at because they are quite literal. Like I think that there's a lot of like abstract human qualities that they have a lot of trouble like really engaging with in a like a more than a surface level way. Oh yeah, visual artists who use written words in their work. Interesting. Yeah, I have seen like those sort of contemporary artists who have like printing like pamphlets and stuff. Yeah, no, I think there's definitely so much space to uh, think about this, and I think this is it's very adaptable, and I think there's in fact, like the most interesting insights are going to come from like not this like proof of concept basic level that I've done already. That's kind of like, okay, well, we know that Darwin is, influencing the people he's writing letters with, right? It's kind of just showing that the method is working, but the most interesting results are going to be coming from creatively applying it to like contexts where you wouldn't expect there to be relationships and influence.
We got a question from Charlie Perez, and I apologize, the Zoom chat is kind of jumping around on me, so I might be missing. I'll have to go back and look. Is the embedding tool you discussed essentially a pre-trained model? So could it be applied to a much smaller project, or would a similarly large corpus be necessary to effectively use this method?
Yeah, so GT is pre-trained, and it works very well. Especially like the more contemporary your problem is, the better it'll work because it's mostly trained on contemporary text. But even initially, without doing my like minor fine tuning, it worked like fine on this sort of historical text, right? So if you're interested in reproducing the pipeline, you can do this with a very small amount of data. You can do this with an arbitrarily small amount of data because the pre-trained model is fine. And even with my fine tuning, right? Like the amount of input data wasn't limited by how much data I had. It was like I had to like actually annotate pairs from the text, right? So you don't need a large amount of data to get started with this at all. Like you can do it with arbitrarily small projects.
That's exciting because there's lots of domains that have not a whole lot of text. Yeah.
So we've got a question from Laurie. Are you able to analyze handwritten documents to compare them with published texts? I'd expect that would not be possible without expensive handwriting analysis over time.
Yeah.
It's kind of our bag, but
yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't really. So we actually have the digitized Darwin letters, like the actual transcribed Darwin letters from volunteers that I just threw into the system that I think I didn't mention. But I haven't looked at the handwriting text recognition because I think it's like the models currently are like very hard to use and they need a lot of fine tuning. And I just didn't have the time or resources to really look at that. But I think it would definitely be interesting, sort of like the changes between like manuscript versions and printed versions, right? I think there would definitely be a lot of potential there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have all kinds of ideas about like genetic additions and things that way.
Yeah.
So yeah, wow. Okay. But back to the questions. So one of the studies you mentioned looked at the evolution of the meaning of terms like cabinet over time. How do you think changing the meaning of terms or the change in meaning of terms over time affected the similarity score for passages and works written a significant number of years apart? If the errors introduced are meaningful, do you think there's scope for comparing embeddings from language models trained on texts from specific time periods?
Yeah, this is definitely something I need to look at for future iterations of the project. It's not, yeah, I haven't calculated that sort of drift now, but I think at like a high level, I don't see that like there's a smaller percentage. Like the accuracy for how well it corresponds with what we'd expect isn't getting worse or better over time. Which is not necessarily fully convincing, I guess. Another issue I think is that it's quite difficult to kind of know what we're missing, like the false negatives, because you actually have to read like you have to read every like document in the corpus to be confident that you're not missing anything, right? And I think it's just not really feasible to and I'm thinking about ways to like try to measure that or approximate that, but it's very hard. I think it's inherently like dealing with this kind of historical data. It's hard to be sure that you're not missing things that should be similar, but are not picked up because of like language differences. Yeah, and I think a lot of these projects, that, as I've talked before, they are very focused on the specific linguistic changes over time. But yeah, my project is less so.
Lucian, so I don't want to end this, so if there are any other questions, please type them in, but Lucian, would you mind unsharing, because it occurred to me that because of the slide sharing issue, we weren't able to promote our next talk. Okay, so we do want to actually
throw this up here. So we've got 2 more coming up in January. One's Your First Crowdsourcing Project, which is a great introduction to crowdsourcing. And then at the end of January, we actually have Victoria Van Heinig and Bern,
whose name last time I don't remember,
coming to talk about accessibility and transcriptions. So we think those are both going to be really fun and interesting. I saw one more question in the chat about language.
Okay. Right. What about language coverage? Back to Lucian.
There's a lot of work on the multilingual models. I use the one I'm using is English only, but there's definitely a lot of potential for. I think they definitely are much like worse in terms of accuracy, right? So because at least for this initial small proof of concept, I'm just using English text. I used an English only model, but people are doing a lot of work on these sentence embedding models in multiple languages. It's very interesting, it's very exciting work, but I think they are just like, the quality is definitely much worse because they have to represent a lot of different they have to use the same size of kind of like embedding space and neural network model to represent, you know, like infinitely many different languages, or however many different languages that they cover.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things when you start talking about lesser represented languages is because all of these approaches are very statistically and mathematically based, they work, but the training corpora are just so much smaller.
Yeah.
So I would say, you know, based on what I know, Spanish probably works really well because there's a lot of Spanish out there and there's a lot of models trained on Spanish, but you know, pick your you know, ancient
not
probably not as easy to use. Right.
Okay, we've got a very practical question. Do you know if there's a way to detect AI in a written work?
Everything I've seen is that the current commercial models don't really work from what I've seen. Like they just throw up a lot of false positives where people are putting in like articles that, you know, they published in like 2016 or whatever, and they're like 100% AI generated. So I think a lot of very smart, well-funded people are trying to work on it, but I don't know if they've gotten it down yet. Yeah.
Well, great. I think that's a good
stopping point. I think that's a good stopping point.
Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking Lucian. This is fantastic. We really appreciate you coming and spending the time. This was really wonderful.
Thanks everyone for listening.